In the summer of 1820, a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson supposedly climbed the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey, carrying a basket of tomatoes. A crowd had gathered because word had spread that he intended to do something reckless. He was going to eat one, in public, on purpose. According to the legend, a doctor stood nearby ready to administer an antidote. Onlookers gasped as Johnson bit into the fruit. He did not collapse. He did not foam at the mouth. He simply finished the tomato, wiped his chin, and reached for another. The crowd, so the story goes, was stunned into silence, and from that single act of defiance, America's fear of the tomato finally began to crack. It is a fantastic story. There is just one problem. Historians have never been able to find a single contemporary newspaper account of it happening. No diary entry, no court record, no witness testimony from 1820 itself. The earliest known version of the tale did not appear in print until decades later, and most food historians now classify it as folklore, a myth invented well after the fact to explain a fear that was already fading on its own. The tomato did not need a hero on a courthouse staircase. The truth of why Europeans and Americans feared this fruit for 2 centuries is stranger, slower, and far more revealing than any single dramatic moment. And it starts 8,000 miles away in the volcanic soil of a different continent entirely. The tomato's wild ancestors grew in the coastal deserts of western South America, in what is now Peru and Ecuador, as a small, tart, currant-sized fruit that bore almost no resemblance to what sits on a supermarket shelf today. Nobody is entirely sure when domestication began, but by the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica in the early 1500s, the Aztecs had already spent centuries breeding the plant into something larger, sweeter, and more useful. They called it tomatal, and it appeared constantly in their cuisine, chopped into sauces with chili peppers, ground into pastes, mixed with squash seeds. Spanish soldiers marching through the markets of Tenochtitlan encountered baskets of tomatoes stacked alongside chili peppers and cacao, and by the 1520s, ships were carrying tomato seeds back across the Atlantic, along with gold, silver, and the wreckage of an empire. At first, almost nobody in Europe cared. The tomato arrived quietly, without ceremony, tucked among dozens of other unfamiliar New World plants that Spanish botanists were cataloging out of scientific curiosity rather than culinary interest. It showed up first in Spain and Italy sometime around the 1540s, grown in monastery gardens and private collections as a botanical novelty. Nobody was cooking with it. They were staring at it. And the moment European botanists actually looked closely at the plant, they noticed something deeply unsettling. The tomato belonged to the nightshade family, the same botanical group that included henbane, mandrake, and deadly nightshade itself, a plant so lethal that a handful of its berries could kill a grown adult within hours. This was not a coincidence anyone could ignore. European herbalists had spent centuries learning to fear the Solanaceae family for good reason, and the tomato's leaves, stems, and unripe green fruit genuinely do contain solanine, a toxic compound that can cause nausea and digestive distress in large enough quantities. The people who first classified the tomato were not being paranoid. They were applying real, hard-won botanical knowledge to a fruit that looked disturbingly like it belonged in the same dangerous family as some of the deadliest plants they knew. The English herbalist John Gerard cemented the reputation in 1597 when he published his massive reference work, Gerard's Herbal, one of the most influential botanical texts of the era. Gerard described the tomato plant in detail, noted its similarity to mandrake and other nightshades, and declared it to be of rank and stinking savor, unfit for human consumption. He was not writing folk superstition. He was writing what passed for cutting-edge science in Elizabethan England, and thousands of readers across the English-speaking world took his word for it. If the most respected herbalist in the country said the tomato was dangerous, that was close enough to settled fact. The name itself did not help. In several European languages, the tomato became known by names that leaned directly into either danger or seduction. The French called it pomme d'amour, the love apple, tying it to rumors that it functioned as an aphrodisiac, which in a deeply religious, sexually conservative society was its own kind of red flag. In German-speaking regions, it eventually picked up the nickname Liebesapfel, carrying the same implication. Meanwhile, in parts of England and colonial America, it circulated under a far darker label, the poison apple. Two names, two completely different fears, and both of them kept people from putting the thing anywhere near their mouths. But fear alone does not explain 200 years of avoidance across an entire continent. Fear explains hesitation. What explains the persistence is something almost nobody talking about tomato history gets exactly right, and it involves dinnerware. Wealthy Europeans in the 1500s and 1600s did not eat off ceramic or porcelain the way ordinary people did. Fine tableware for the aristocracy and the rising merchant class was typically made of pewter, an alloy that was, at the time, composed largely of tin mixed with a significant percentage of lead. Lead was cheap, it was workable, and it gave pewter plates a smooth, attractive shine that porcelain could not always match outside of expensive imported Chinese ware. For decades, nobody understood the danger sitting in plain sight on their dinner tables. Tomatoes are highly acidic. When an acidic food sits on a lead-containing surface for any length of time, the acid leaches lead out of the metal and into the food itself. A wealthy European in the 1600s who sliced a fresh tomato and let it rest on a pewter plate before eating it was, without realizing it, dosing that meal with lead. And the symptoms of acute lead poisoning, abdominal pain, vomiting, confusion, and in severe cases death, looked to observers at the time exactly like a violent reaction to eating a suspicious new fruit. Nobody in the 1600s had the toxicology to trace the actual cause back to the plate rather than the plant. What they saw instead confirmed everything they already suspected. The nobleman ate the tomato. The nobleman got violently ill. Sometimes the nobleman died. The tomato had done it, or so it seemed, and each incident reinforced the reputation that had started with Gerard's herbal decades earlier. There is a specific piece of the popular version of this story worth pausing on, because it has spread widely online in recent years in an oversimplified form. The claim that tomatoes were called poison apples specifically because rich people who owned pewter plates kept dying, while poor people who ate off wood and did not own tomatoes stayed perfectly safe, makes for a tidy narrative. The underlying chemistry is real. Lead does leach from pewter into acidic food, and lead poisoning was a documented and serious problem across aristocratic Europe for centuries, showing up in everything from wine to cosmetics to piping. But historians who specialize in early food history caution that direct documented cases of tomato-specific lead poisoning deaths are difficult to pin down in the primary sources, and much of the popular telling condenses a broader, murkier pattern of suspicion into one clean cause-and-effect story. What can be said with confidence is that the class divide in tableware was real, that lead poisoning from pewter was a genuine and widespread problem among the European elite, and that this almost certainly contributed to reinforcing a fear that had already taken root through botanical association. The tomato did not need the pewter plates to become feared, but the pewter plates likely made the fear feel confirmed by direct experience, generation after generation, in wealthy households across the continent. Meanwhile, poorer Europeans, who could not afford pewter and ate off simple wooden trenchers or crude earthenware, faced none of this risk. And in a cruel twist of circumstance, the very people least able to afford tomatoes in the first place were also the people least likely to be poisoned by eating them, while the people who could afford this exotic new fruit were dining on the one surface in Europe most likely to turn it dangerous. While Northern and Western Europe spent 2 centuries treating the tomato as a decorative curiosity at best and a suspected killer at worst, something completely different was happening in the South. Italy took a different path almost from the beginning, and the reasons why revealed just how much of this fear was regional rather than universal. Southern Italian cooks, particularly around Naples, began experimenting with tomatoes in the kitchen far earlier than their counterparts to the north. Naples in the 1600s was one of the poorest, most densely populated cities in Europe, and its cuisine had always leaned heavily on whatever ingredients were cheap, abundant, and calorically useful. The volcanic soil around Mount Vesuvius, it turned out, happened to be extraordinarily well-suited to growing tomatoes. producing fruit that was sweeter and more flavorful than what struggled in the cooler soils further north. By 1692, a Neapolitan cookbook had already published recipes calling for tomato sauce, making it one of the earliest known culinary documents in Europe to treat the fruit as an actual ingredient rather than a suspicious, ornamental plant. Southern Italian street food culture, built around flatbreads sold cheaply to laborers and the urban poor, eventually married tomato sauce to bread and cheese, laying the groundwork for what the world would eventually know as pizza. When the dish now called pizza, margherita was supposedly created in 1889 for the visiting Italian Queen Margherita of Savoy, tomato sauce was already a settled, unremarkable staple of Neapolitan cooking, not a daring experiment. Italy had quietly solved its tomato problem more than a century before the rest of Europe caught up. Spain moved almost as quickly, in part because the tomato had arrived there first and had never entirely lost its foothold. Spanish cooks began folding tomatoes into stews and sauces by the 1600s, and the fruit eventually became foundational to dishes like gazpacho. But north of the Pyrenees and the Alps, in England, in the German states, in much of France outside a handful of southern regions, the suspicion held firm for generation after generation. English cookbooks from the 1700s barely mention the tomato at all, and when they do, they still frame it primarily as a garden ornamental rather than a food. What actually broke the fear in Northern Europe and North America was not a single dramatic act of public defiance on a courthouse staircase. It was slower and far less cinematic. Trade routes expanded. Immigration patterns shifted populations and cuisines across borders. Southern European and Mediterranean cooking traditions gradually seeped northward through cookbooks, through merchants, through the ordinary churn of cultural exchange that happens whenever people move and eat and share recipes with their neighbors. By the early 1800s, French cookbooks had begun including tomato recipes with increasing regularity. American agricultural writers started promoting the tomato as a legitimate garden crop rather than a decorative curiosity. Seed catalogs began listing it alongside beans and squash instead of alongside flowers. The Robert Gibbon Johnson legend, whether or not it actually happened the way it is told, captures something true about this period even if the specific event is likely invented. Attitudes toward the tomato really were shifting rapidly in exactly the years the story claims it occurred, and the tale likely persisted precisely because it dramatized a change that was already well underway by 1820, giving it a face, a date, and a hero, the same way the Tad Dorgan cartoon myth would later give the hot dog a tidy origin story it never actually had. People love a clean narrative more than a messy truth, and both the tomato and the hot dog got one, whether the facts fully supported it or not. By the mid-1800s, the tomato's transformation was essentially complete across most of Europe and North America. American cookbooks from the 1850s and 1860s included dozens of tomato recipes, treating it as a completely unremarkable pantry staple. Canning technology, developed and refined throughout the 1800s, allowed tomatoes to be preserved and shipped far beyond their growing season, accelerating adoption even further. What had been feared as a possible poison for 2 full centuries was, within the span of a single generation, becoming one of the most commonly eaten fruits in the Western world. Today, the numbers involved in global tomato production would have been unimaginable to the botanists who once classified this fruit alongside deadly nightshade. The world grows more than 180 million metric tons of tomatoes annually, making it one of the most widely cultivated crops on the planet. China alone produces more than a third of the global supply, followed by India and the United States. In America, the tomato has become so central to the national diet that it now anchors an entire category of processed food, from ketchup to pasta sauce to canned soup, generating tens of billions of dollars in economic activity every year across farming, processing, and retail. Italy, the country that quietly solved the tomato problem centuries before anyone else, remains globally associated with tomato-based cuisine to this day, its tomato sauce traditions now considered so fundamental to Italian identity that few people realize the fruit is not native to the country at all. There is also a peculiar legal footnote to this story that most people never learn. In 1893, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case Nix versus Hedden that the tomato should legally be classified as a vegetable rather than a fruit for the purposes of import tariffs, despite the fact that, botanically speaking, a tomato is unquestionably a fruit, the ripened ovary of a flowering plant containing seeds. The ruling had nothing to do with science and everything to do with tariff law, since vegetables imported into the United States at the time were taxed while fruits were not, and tomatoes were overwhelmingly used and understood by ordinary consumers as a savory vegetable rather than a sweet fruit. The case remains one of the strangest collisions of botany and bureaucracy in American legal history, and it means that, officially, under U.S. law, the tomato lives in a permanent state of contradiction, simultaneously a fruit in nature and a vegetable in the eyes of the government. What makes the tomato story genuinely remarkable is not just that the fear existed, but how thoroughly it has been forgotten. Nobody today hesitates before slicing a tomato onto a sandwich. Nobody eyes a jar of pasta sauce with suspicion. The fruit that European herbalists once linked to the same family as deadly nightshade, that wealthy aristocrats blamed for poisonings their own dinnerware likely caused, that clergymen in some regions treated with the same wariness other clergy once reserved for the potato, is now so completely normalized that its entire 200-year reputation as a probable poison has simply vanished from cultural memory. The tomato did not overcome its fear through a single dramatic public stunt on a courthouse staircase. It overcame it the way most deep-seated fears actually die, slowly, quietly, through generations of ordinary people who kept cooking with it anyway until the fear itself became the strange part of the story, rather than the fruit. Somewhere in Naples right now, a cook is simmering tomatoes down into a sauce using a technique that traces back nearly 4 centuries. Somewhere in a lab, agricultural scientists are breeding new tomato varieties for disease resistance and shelf life. And somewhere, a home gardener is slicing a fresh tomato onto a plate that is almost certainly not made of lead, eating a fruit that European nobility once feared might kill them, without a second thought. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which food myth you want debunked next. And smash that like button so more people can find this one.